especially if I was in part of that.
Especially if you were part of it. Or Lindsey Graham.
Kevin, the main thing I'm concerned about, we got money, right? The money's good. A little bit. It's on YouTube.
Okay. For those of you at home, we are live here at the city council meeting. We are going through some technical difficulties, which we have largely overcome, it seems. However, we're still trying to finalize getting all of our members present and accounted for. I see we have Councilman Jabala with us. Councilman, can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Excellent. And let's run one more time through, and I guess Amanda will be good to go. Glenn.
Yes.
Very good. Councilwoman Irvin. Tracy.
Yes.
Excellent. Councilwoman Gibson Highmore. You.
Yes.
Okay. Excellent. And Councilwoman Blake.
Yes.
Very good. We've already had the meeting is in session, in fact, and we already have had the pledge and the invocation. And so we've also passed for the record for the approval of the minutes for September 14th, 21st, and 29th. When we were interrupted by our technical difficulties, I was going to move to taking out of order, unless the council objects, the accommodations tax advisory presentation by Mr. Chad Patterson. Is there any objection from anyone from us doing that? Very well. Amanda or Scotty, is Mr. Patterson available? Is he with us?
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Patterson is being led into the meeting now. Sure. All right. So, for those of you, there we have Mr. Patterson. Mr. Patterson, good to see you. And for those of you at home, please remember that if you are waiting to speak in this meeting, we will call you in at the appointed and appropriate time, just as we have now with Mr. Patterson. But you should watch the meeting on YouTube. And please, when we do call you into the meeting, if you'll turn your computer down so that we don't have feedback. Mr. Patterson, all right, can you hear us? Chad?
Oh, sorry.
How are things, Chad?
Oh, he's picking up. So we're just doing what we can right now.
Very well. Well, thank you for being with us. And I know you're here today to make a presentation with regard to the accommodations tax. So please do so.
Well, thank you very much, Mayor Wakilo and council members, for this opportunity to come before you and present the City of Florence Accommodations Tax Committee's recommendation for the distribution of 21 funds. Of our committee are appointees of the City Council, and we take our service very seriously. The committee is responsible for making recommendations to City Council for the expenditure of the 65% accommodations tax funds received by the state. These funds are estimated to be $587,000 this year, and they're available and distributed and used for tourism promotion. Laws and city guidelines, the committee of 23 and the event past, present, and bring tourists to our community, quality of life for approximately of this 4,006 requests. The allocation fiscally our community. Again, thank you on this committee, and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Chad, for your presentation and for being with us, particularly during these under these difficult circumstances. Members, it's obvious if you look at the attachment to the ATAX section of your agenda, the recommendation deals with the recommendation for the distribution of about $587,000, which is substantially lower than we have become accustomed to. It's my impression, maybe this is a question for Mr. Yocum, but it's obvious to me on first impression that that's a product of the decrease in accommodations tax revenues as a result of the virus and so forth. So the recommendation, though it mirrors very similarly the previous allocations in previous years, the numbers are significantly lower as a result of decreased collections. Is there a motion?
Move to approve.
There's a motion by the pro tem to adopt the recommendation to accommodate. Is there a second?
Second.
For the second, I think that came from Councilwoman Irvin. I see her raising her hand. Any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, the like sign. Very well. The Accommodations Tax Advisory Committee's recommendation is adopted unanimously. And I know, Mr. Patterson, thank you again for being with us and being patient and for your service, Mr. Patterson.
Thank you very much.
Next matter for our consideration in order of the agenda is an appearance before council by Mr. John Brewer. Danny, I suppose we'll have to bring need to bring Mr. Brewer into the meeting.
Not there.
All right. Mr. Brewer is not here. Apparently does that mean he's not called in?
He did earlier. I thought he didn't at all.
Okay. Well, if Mr. Brewer comes in later, if you all will give us a sign, we'll speak to him at that point. But if he's listening to us at home, I think I know what Mr. Brewer intends to speak to us about, and I want to assuage any concerns he has. And my conversations with staff, what I understand is that Mr. Brewer owns 1,111 Cox Street. And 111 Cox Street is a property that's over near McLeod Hospital. And Mr. Brewer is aware, as council is and the public is, that from time to time, as McLeod has brought properties around them, periodically they'll ask us to abandon an interest in a roadway that only serves properties that they own, with the intention of removing that roadway and developing an entire area that might otherwise have been 2 blocks, and now it's 1 block because McLeod owns all the property. Mr. Brewer has expressed some concern about that, because if his property on Cox Street, if Cox Street were abandoned, he wouldn't have any access to his property. Have I recited that correctly, Mr. Osterman and Mr. Moore? All right. Staff, I understand, has assured him, and I want him to be assured from council and the mayor that we have no intention of abandoning Cox Street. We could not, in fact, abandon Cox Street because Cox Street is a state street. And furthermore, the way our development ordinances are written, we couldn't abandon the roadway even if it was ours, if it would isolate a property such that it could not be accessed. And so, Mr. Cox, if you're listening to us at home, I think I'm being told that he's on now.
He's calling in now.
He's calling in now. So we'll wait just a second and we'll see if I was right about what Mr. Brewer wants to talk about.
Hey, Clint, can you show us where that street is over there? And what's it adjacent to with the McLeod Regional Facility? I did not look up that. Let's see. It's a state street. We can't close anyway. So that's
State road.
the problem.
I know exactly where it's at.
Okay. Mr. Brewer, are you with us?
I am.
Well,
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon to you, Mr. Brewer, and I'm sorry for the technical difficulties we've had today, but we're going to muddle through it.
Okay, very good. Well, again, let me thank you all for giving me this opportunity. And Mayor Wakila, I was looking on the YouTube channel, and you were exactly right. This was what I was calling in. I appreciate your clarification and addressing the issue. As you mentioned, and I'll just reiterate, I was concerned about the possibility of a closure of that section of Cox Street, which would, as you said, would deny me access to my property at 1111 Cox Street. So I appreciate and quite relieved to hear that that will not be the case, that section of Cox Street will remain open. So I really appreciate that, and I appreciate the attentiveness you all have all given to my inquiries about this issue.
Sure, and we thank you for calling in, Mr. Brewer. And again, sorry for the difficulty, but it's always good to be able to communicate with folks and make very clear what the law is and what's going to occur and what's not to occur. So do not be concerned.
All right, very good. Well, thank you
Mr.
all.
Mayor.
And
Mr. Mayor,
Mr. Brewer, would you hold on with us just for a minute?
sure, absolutely.
Councilman?
Mr. Mayor,
Yes, ma'am.
could we send Mr. Brewer a letter to that effect so he'll have something in writing?
Sure, we will do.
Thank you.
Very well, Mr. Brewer, were you able to hear that?
I was, and I appreciate it, and I appreciate the councilwoman covering something that I should have covered myself. I would appreciate something in writing, and I really appreciate her catching that. I should have asked for that myself, and I really appreciate her covering me for that. Yes, if I could get something in writing, that would be extremely helpful for my records.
No problem. We'll take care of that, Mr. Brewer. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Great.
Bye-bye.
Next matter for our consideration is ordinances in position. The first is Bill 2020-30, an ordinance submission approving the construction of capital improvement projects, including the repair and retrofit of the stormwater system to minimize damage to public and private property. This passed unanimously on first reading. Is there a motion?
So move.
Motion by the pro tem. I think I heard a motion by Councilwoman Irvin as well. So we'll treat that as a motion and second. Any discussion? Very well. Hearing no discussion, all in favor, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, like sign. Very well. Measure passes unanimously. Next is Bill number 2020-31 for a second reading. In order to amend the budget for the city of Florence for the fiscal year beginning July 1st, 2020 and ending June the 30th, 2021, to reappropriate 2019-20 funds for the completed projects and purchases. Again, a motion by the second by Councilwoman Irvin, I believe.
Yes.
Very well. Thank you, Councilwoman. Any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor, please indicate by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Measure passes unanimously. Next matter for our consideration is Bill 220-32 for a second reading. In order to amend the budget of the city for the fiscal year beginning July 1st, 2020, ending June 30th, 2021, to appropriate funds from the excess fund balance. Is there a motion? Motion by the pro tem,
Second.
second by Councilwoman Irvin. Discussion. Hearing none, all in favor, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, like sign. Motion passes unanimously. Next bill is Bill 2020-33, in order to amend the UDO to add conditions for brew pubs, microbreweries, and micro distilleries. Is there a motion?
So move.
Motion by the pro tem. I heard a second motion by someone.
That was me.
Woman Moore, very well, thank you. It has been a motion and a second. Any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor, please indicate by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed, like sign. Measure passes unanimously. Next is Bill number 2020-34, ordinance to annex and zone RG3 and CG88. I'm sorry, and CG 88 acres located along Freedom Boulevard, identified as tax map
So move.
171014. There's a motion.
Second.
Councilwoman Moore, is that correct?
Yes.
Very well. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Councilman Williams Blake. Any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor, please indicate by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed, the like sign. Measure passes unanimously. Next is Bill number 2020-35 for a second reading. This is an ordinance to amend Section 4 of the City of Florence Code of Ordinances for the addition of single-family and multifamily residential rental housing registration. We have folks that have signed up to comment again on this ordinance. We also have an amendment that we should take up, or at least one amendment at any rate that we should take up. I think the appropriate procedure then is to first hear from those who would like to comment, call those folks in, hear from them, then take up motions and action. The first individual that has signed up to speak is Mr. Gary Finkley, and I'm told by Ms. Davis that he's coming into the meeting. Mr. Finkley, we have you. Can you hear us? All right. They're working on unmuting you, Mr. Finkley. All right. In spite of our better judgment, we've unmuted you, Gary. Can you hear us?
There you go.
How about now?
Excellent. Excellent. Good afternoon, Ms. Finkley.
Good afternoon. Thank you for allowing me to have input. I am appreciate all of the receptiveness staff and council have had to many suggestions that myself and others, different stakeholders have had in this ordinance. I have spent a lot of time with your staff, and many of you have called and discussed various issues and provisions to explain them, to explain the intent. And I do think with all that explanation, there's some obviously issues that we disagree on from a substantive matter, but I think the changes that were implemented will help create a better ordinance as it relates to procedure, solving the problem that seeks to be solved. And I just first thank you and staff for hearing those concerns and the input to make this a better product. I think now that I've been through this ordinance, I only had one additional suggestion to clarify the ordinance that doesn't change the intent. And I just emailed that out to most all of you. I think I left off two because you asked me to speak before I hit send. So, but I have some other issues with the ordinance, but I understand they will not be accepted, so no need to discuss them. So the one last change I made was to clarify that a landlord, although the landlord or representative is ultimately responsible for fixing his property, this provision in the ordinance doesn't preclude him from seeking relief against the responsible party. But with that being said, Mr. Mayor, you're going to ask if I support an ordinance. So, so I'll steal your thunder. I don't support the concept. Okay. I don't necessarily support what we're doing here, at least right now, because I don't think we've tried what was on the books beforehand. And I do have grave concerns of nature of unintended consequences may have. Had different folks from different stakeholders to have input, and I just wanted to remind council of that, because I think the next step, once this is adopted, is how do we eliminate some of the unintended consequences, such as, will this lead to lack of affordable housing? Will this increase rent? And I know the increased rent is not necessarily in the dollar-to-dollar cost for the fee, the business license fee or the registry fee, but just from a compliance standpoint, I think is what some are concerned with the cost. And, just providing housing to those who may be displaced. So, I encourage council to put on their hats and think about that for next year. And I know Joy McMillan had a suggestion to, even to some extent, provide grants to various landlords to rehabilitate their property. But the other part of that would be if the property is rehabilitated, to stabilize and maintain rent for a certain number of years, so the tenant is not required to pay the increased rent. But I know there's a lot that goes into that. And so I look forward, as well as the folks from my group, working with you on resolving any unintended consequences. The other issue I want to point out and just prepare council and staff for is, the International Property Maintenance Code and the UDO not only applies to rental housing, but it applies to owner occupied housing. And, while I understand, particularly from the hot spots that Mr. Moore displayed at one of our earlier meetings with some of the issues, we also will need to focus on issues with folks who own their homes. So, with all that being said, I appreciate the input. If you are going to pass an ordinance, I think this is about as close to good as we can get it at this point. And thank you for having that input.
Mr. Mayor. Councilman Bailey.
Gary, I appreciate your sending over that revision that you proposed that just got emailed to us, and you have it identified as 4904.4. But looking at the most recent version of the amended ordinance that Jim Peterson, the City Attorney Peterson, sent out, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that in that most recent version, it's 904.3, not 904.4. Jim, are you there? Can you clarify that for us with regard to the amended registry that has been worked on?
I am here. I think that the language
his proposed substitution paragraph, if I'm not mistaken, in this most recent version you sent out, it's 904.3, not 904.4. To section 4904. Gary, do you see what I'm referring to?
I do see what you're saying, and I think you are correct, because we eliminated subsection 2 that dealt with occupancy and replaced that in another section of the ordinance.
That's correct.
So I think you're correct, even though I can't quite see it, but I think you're absolutely correct.
That is correct. It is that the proposed change that he sent would actually be to 4904.3.
Right. And so, Mr. Mayor, I don't know procedurally what's the best way to do it, but I would like to at least have the city attorney comment on, Jim, your thoughts on the change that has been sent out to us by Gary.
Certainly, I think procedurally, I think it's appropriate for Ms. Pearson to respond to your questions right now. What just so everybody understands what I plan as far as votes, as I understand the way the rule works, the way we should proceed is at the conclusion of comments from folks in the public, we'll have a motion and second. What I would plan is that motion and second be as to the ordinance as it was passed at the last meeting. Then before entertaining a vote on that motion, I think the procedure, and I'm looking at Jim to make sure I got Robert's rules down. God knows I'm talking about Robert's rules, buddy, so forgive me, please. But then to have motions for amendments, George, at that, and then ultimately a vote on the ordinance as amended or as not amended at the conclusion of those amendments. If everybody understands, then that litany.
So at this point in time, the amended ordinance is not before us. So I would like to, Jim, your thoughts on the change to the that Gary sent out. If we and you know, unfortunately, we're not in a position where we can do we're having to do this by Zoom. So I think it's just the best that we've got to handle it. Jim, can you please, as city attorney, give us your thoughts on that?
I can. The addition that Mr. Finkley has recommended, I think does nothing other than clarify exactly what we have stated our purpose for that section was, in that the addition he is proposing adds to the section in the latest version the following sentence: nothing herein precludes any party from seeking damages or indemnification from another party based on contract, statute, or common law. And that's the addition that's been proposed. I certainly think that is consistent with what we are trying to do with the section. And from an attorney standpoint, I would have no objection to that added language. Of course, excuse me, what that whole section is designed to do is to make it clear that even if damage to a residential rental unit has been done by a tenant, for example, and there might be a lease or a contract that says that the repair of that is ultimately, or is the responsibility, the tenant can be held responsible for the damage they have caused to it, or in reality, a lease can, as specified in the Landlord Tenant Act for South Carolina, a lease could say that all repairs to a property are the responsibility of a tenant under certain circumstances. So all this is doing is our section makes it clear that ultimately, if the unit is not repaired, ultimately the city will look to the owner and or the responsible representative. And if it's not repaired and a notice of violation is issued and the notice is not complied with, ultimately the permit to rent that unit could be removed regardless of whose responsibility it was to pay for the repairs. Now, the language that Mr. Finkley has suggested added just makes it clear that that ultimate responsibility from a permitting standpoint doesn't change the law applicable by contract or state statute with respect to who ultimately might be responsible for paying for those repairs. But the city, from a permitting standpoint, will be looking ultimately to the owner or responsible representative from a permitting standpoint.
Jim, while you're there, I have one other significant issue that Gary presented, and that I know you incorporated in, dealt with the criminal aspect of it and how it is limited now to a failure to maintain the permitting. And would you speak to that for just a moment? Because I know that was another important point that Mr. Finkley raised. Would you speak to that, please?
Before you go to that, Jim, George, what I wanted to clarify before Jim left that other issue was, just so everybody is clear, regardless of whether any change is made to the ordinance that passed last month, the law is that the landowner can always go after any responsible party, even if what this council passed was exactly the same as the bill we passed last month, or any of the amendments that have been discussed or considered. Okay, I'm sorry to interrupt you, George, but I just
no, that's all right. Thank you for that. But I just wanted
amendments. That's a very important point, and everybody should be assured of that fact. Amended or not, that remains the case. The landlord's rights against persons who have damaged their property remains irrespective of the ordinance. I'm sorry. Go ahead and continue there. George asked a question about another section.
Yeah, so it's my understanding that, and what I would, and I don't know, again, procedurally how we need to do this, but I would suggest that the amended ordinance that we will be voting on include the changes that Mr. Finkley just provided to us, which I think we've heard from our city attorney on, and so that I don't want to have to go back and do it afterwards. So I'd like for us to be able to include the change in the language, the clarification to section 904.3 that Mr. Finkley had sent to us that I think the city attorney has commented on. Is that procedurally, is that what we're going to be voting on, including that change? That's just a question I have procedurally.
My expectation is that at the conclusion of the comment time, we'll take motions on the ordinance as passed last time and any amendments that anyone wants to offer in any form.
All right, so we're going to handle, I just want to make sure that what we're going to be voting on, the amended ordinance we're going to be voting on, is one that we all understand what's in it. That was my question. So Jim, I'm sorry, the other aspect of it that I commented earlier dealt with the change regarding the criminal aspect of it. Would you speak to that for a moment, please?
Yes, I will. In the version that was sent out this morning, the last version under section 4-905(3), and the change there was designed, there had been concerns expressed because this ordinance, like just about every ordinance in the city, has language that allows the city to issue a summons and take someone to municipal court for a criminal violation of the ordinance. There was concern because this ordinance also sets up a notice of violation procedure that we're all on board on and is set out in other sections of the ordinance. And there was some concern expressed as to, in essence, having two different enforcement mechanisms, one being a criminal enforcement mechanism and one being, for lack of a better term, a criminal or administrative approach to enforcement. To clarify, the main thing that the city was concerned about having the potential for criminal enforcement is when someone is operating a residential rental unit without a permit. Either that permit has been revoked or they never came in and got the required permit. So the change in section 4-905(3) was designed to make it clear that the criminal violation under this ordinance is only for operating a residential rental unit without a permit. The other violations of this ordinance would be handled by going through the notice of violation process that's set forth in section 4-906. And the reason we wanted to separate out, obviously, all of those notice of violations, that procedure, ultimately, the ultimate enforcement mechanism is the revocation of the rental unit permit. Well, if someone is operating a rental unit without a permit, obviously there's nothing we can revoke. So that's the reason that we separated that particular violation out and made it clear that it could remain a criminal violation.
And it's my understanding that, Gary, you've reviewed everything in this most recent version that Jim came up with, and with the inclusion of this language you sent out earlier today, that while I understand you're not in favor of the ordinance as a whole anyway, I understand that, but that your questions specifically have been addressed through all of this process. Is that right?
Absolutely. And I appreciate Jim, particularly this morning, because I know there were two last minute changes, one being the occupancy violations, which I think we cleaned up really nicely. So, you know, like I said, there may be a few substantive issues that I understand will not pass, but as far as the ordinance goes, some of the procedural hurdles, I think they're cleaned up as much as I'm aware of in my reading of it right now. And again, thank you. And I think it'll make it a better ordinance for us all.
Well, I thank you, for, Gary, for the amount of time and effort and energy you put into it, because I think everybody agrees that the result of what we have now in the amended version is far better than what we had before. And ultimately, that's what we're all trying to put in place, is something that works well for everybody. So I thank you for your efforts and your hours of help in this process.
Very well. Thank you, Mr. Finkley.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
The next person who's asked to speak is Mr. Gary Dausch. Ms. Davis, is Mr. Dausch with us? I'm sorry, Mr. Dausch is not called in, I guess, yet. And Trudy Niebert is the next one on the list. Niebert, are you with us? Looks like she may have walked away from her phone. Ms. Niebert. There she is. Good afternoon, Ms. Niebert. This is Stephen Wakia. You're on. She's not called in, I guess, yet. And Trudy Niebert is the next one on the list.
Hi.
Niebert, are you with?
I am.
Hello, Ms. Niebert. You will turn off the speaker on your computer. It will prevent the feedback.
Give me just a moment.
Sure. There she is. Good afternoon, Ms. Niebert.
It's not. I'm trying to figure out how to turn this down.
Sure, take your time.
Well, fudge. Okay, is that better?
It is. Thank you, Ms. Niebert. You are. We can all hear you.
Okay, so here's a couple of things. I didn't get an opportunity to speak the last time. I do want to thank you for taking me today, taking the time to listen to me. I did not get the opportunity last time because I was confused about the meeting time. When I called in to confirm that I was on to speak, I was given to understand that the meeting time was the same as the first one, and it wasn't. And unfortunately, I worked, so I had to take time off today to be here. My concerns about a lot of this, I feel like I'm the only person speaking up for tenants. Okay. Having been one, I'm a homeowner now, but I remember being a tenant, and I was very lucky to have people who were good landlords. Okay. And that's not the case for everybody. I'm in favor of a rental registry, but I still feel like what's out there is not at all concerning tenants. It seems very weighted toward the folks who are landlords. Now, I'm not an attorney. I get that. But I've read what's available to me on the website as far as the newest version of the ordinance. I assume it's the newest. And I still have lots of concerns. Okay. But before I get to that, my other concern, I don't know if y'all received it, but about a week and a half ago, just after our last meeting, I received a letter in the mail. It was a scare letter that this rental registry was going to force rents to go up, and, that it was completely bad for the city. So I did a little investigation. I wanted to know who sent that to me. So I looked them up online. Guess what? Can't find a presence anywhere online, not on Facebook, Friends of Affordable Housing, for affordable housing. Can't find any of that on Facebook, Snapchat, Twitter. They don't exist. So I called the post office because somebody mailed that and there was a post office box addressed to it. Well, that was a fake address. That doesn't exist, that P.O. box. But I said, well, here's a permit number. Somebody stamped this through a business. And I got so far as to find out that it is an active permit, but because it was a second party, I couldn't find out who'd sent it. So whoever sent that really, really is undermining what the city's trying to do here. Okay, so I've got that off my chest. It makes me incredibly unhappy. Things that I have a suspicion of where it came from, but just a suspicion. Okay, so as far as the ordinance goes, I had a few questions. In particular, the fact that we're not going to inspect. Okay, I've gone online and looked at multiple cities, and I've already talked about the fact that I lived in a city where was a registry to start with. If you don't do an inspection in the get-go, and I'm not talking by the landlord because that's somebody who has an interest in that inspection. It should be by a third party, somebody, and that inspection passing. But if you don't do that, overwhelmed people who have issues, you're still going to have to inspect. So why not make it part of how we do this? That's the appropriate way to do it. And that's not just me. That's what most cities do. Can you still hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So the sections that I had concerns about, the grandfathered properties, how is that going to work? I mean, it wasn't very specific about what the grandfathered things were going to be. I think that needs to be spelled out. Okay. Now, there was another thing in here about grouping permits for individual dwellings grouped could mean that, okay, there was almost, let me see, that was in section 4.901. If I'm reading this right. My glasses on so I can see you on the phone. Two, that if there were groups of dwellings that if one passed inspection, they didn't all have to be passing. They would be grouped together as passing. Okay. I think I've got the wrong number written down.
That's okay, Ms. Niebuhr. I think I know what you're going to do.
Okay, so, well, here's my thing of that. So you say you've got a townhome, which is 3 dwellings wide. All right. You've got 3 townhomes next to each other. And if you pass one of those in inspection and the other 2 violate codes, if you get the one and you're relying on somebody who already has an interest in this passing, they pass one, but the other 2 aren't, you've just missed 2 houses that are not livable or potentially not livable. Every dwelling that you're talking about should have to go through this process.
Yes, ma'am, it does. Let me, Ms. Niebuhr, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, that's fine.
I think I can address those issues you've raised, but I don't want to cut you off. If you have more, you were kind of going through a list. If you want to finish your list, I think I can maybe address all of the ones you've raised. Or are you?
Well, one of the other things I wondered about is, okay, and maybe I misunderstood, but how frequently will inspections happen? So this first time they get permitted, time one, okay, from the very start, you get tenant A who moves out and tenant B moves in, out, tenant C moves in. Where in that process?
Okay, so Ms. Niebuhr, let me, can you hear me?
Yes, I sure can. Go ahead.
Yes, ma'am. Let me speak first to the issue, and if I get any of this stuff wrong, I'm sure staff will stop me. And right now, I want to speak based on the ordinance that passed at the last meeting. And I think these answers are probably true no matter which version of what amendment that you're talking about. First, inspections. You are correct. The way the ordinance is drafted, inspections are not conducted every time a permit is issued, nor are they conducted every time a property turns over ownership or a property turns over a new tenant. No doubt there are communities where they do that. But as a practical matter, quite frankly, the city just does not have the resources or the manpower to conduct those sorts of inspections. But that's not to say that inspections won't be conducted. The way we have drafted this ordinance is that inspections will be conducted upon complaints. And if the inspection reveals a violation, then actions taken by the city and so forth. And then the inspections will be conducted prior to re-permitting before permitting a property that has failed an inspection. Now, I understand, and I'm sure that many tenants would say, listen, it would be much better if the city would conduct inspections every time a lease turns over or every time a permit's issued. But I'm afraid, Ms. Niebert, we just simply don't have the staff nor the resources to do that. And quite frankly, if we only inspected the properties that we've had complaints on in the last year, our codes enforcement staff would be very, very busy as it stands. I'm going to also, I'm going to try to address all these issues, and then I'll give you the floor again, of course.
Okay.
To ask about the effect of a violation of one property permitted to an owner as it relates to other properties. And the way this ordinance is drafted, if I'm Stephen Wakila and I own 10 properties, and one of them has a violation and causes it to lose its permit, that doesn't infect, if you will, the other 9 properties. The other 9 permits remain effective. And the fact that I lose the permit on the one property that had a violation does not cause the others to lose its permits. That's the way the ordinance is drafted. Now, what you stated is actually kind of the inverse of that, right? What you understood the ordinance to say was, if one passes, then they all pass. And that's not the case. In fact, it's the reverse. Each property has to be compliant with the law. But if one property fails, even if there are multiple properties owned by the same owner, the other properties don't lose their permits simply because one property loses its permit. Just a confusion in reading that language, but that's what the language intends when it silos off the properties with regard to their permitting. So it's not the case that one property having a permit grants the other property's permits, but it is the case that one property losing its permits doesn't mean the other properties lose their permits.
Okay, can I stop right there? There is a section, it talks about grouping, so that if there were things, in other words, if you own the whole row of townhouses, it's grouped together. That is in here.
Do you, my staff is looking right now for what you're referring to. Do you have a section that you're looking at?
I'm looking again.
Okay.
I believe it's 9015.
49015.
Yes.
That section is related.
Okay, so this is what, and maybe that's a misunderstanding on my part, but it says a rental permit is required for each residential rental unit that is a property owner, that a property owner rents or responsible representative manages on behalf of a property owner. The city shall, per written policy, allow certain residential rental units with the same address or tax map designation to be grouped together under an individual permit. So if all of those townhouses are on one lot, does that not mean that one permit covers all three?
Mr. Moore, should they choose to permit it that way?
And so that is a problem. If you permit one that is a passes code and the other two do not, or have safety issues, then those tenants are at risk.
I think what staff's getting ready to explain this is, however, if you group them all under one permit, and one of those, say it's a townhouse as you described.
Right.
Okay. Instead of Stephen Wakila owning two separate houses that I rent, if I have two separate houses with two separate permits, I lose the permit on one. I have not lost the permit on the other. If I have a duplex and I choose to put that entire duplex all on one permit, and one of the units has a violation that would cause me to lose the permit, but the other units don't, I'll lose the permit for the entire duplex, even though one of the units does not have. So
Okay, that's fine. That's what I want to know.
right, and that's kind of the reverse again of what the way you interpreted it, which is
The language is not clear. It is not clear. I know what your intention is, but it is not clear.
well, I appreciate that, and we'll certainly look at that. But just so you understand, the fact that if you have one permit that's a duplex, the fact that one of the units in the permit is compliant with the permit does not mean that we ignore the fact that other units in the permits are non-compliant. In fact, it's precisely the reverse. Ms. Niebert, you also earlier raised a concern about grandfathering, and
Yes.
it actually raises a point I wanted to make to you. If you, and I'm sure you didn't, I'm sure many people did, if you understand the problem we have in the city and you read this ordinance, you might say, well, this ordinance doesn't address a lot of the problems because it doesn't tell me anything about, right? It doesn't
tell me anything about, I'm sorry, I missed that last part.
It doesn't tell me anything about standards, right? There's nothing in this ordinance that tells you that a landlord has to provide electricity. There's nothing in this ordinance that tells you that a landlord has to provide hot water, okay? And there's a reason for that. The reason for that is those requirements exist already in the law in other ordinances that are on the books in the city, okay? And they are exhaustive. If you went to the city's website and looked at our municipal code, you heard Mr. Finkley talking earlier about the International Property Maintenance Code that the city's adopted. There's all manner of standard that talks about this habitability requirements for properties. That's not recited here because it's already existing in law elsewhere. The purpose of this is to allow us or to aid us in enforcing those standards that already exist. You talked a little bit about the difficulty you had in tracking down who sent you that letter. Well, that's the same difficulty we have sometimes finding out who owns a piece of property and how.
You're preaching to the choir here. I am surrounded by rentals.
Yeah.
I am surrounded by rentals, and this has been a real issue for me personally because some of them are managed by some of what you all call the bad actors.
Mm-hmm.
And it has been a nightmare.
Yes, ma'am. And that's what I understand. That's what this is designed to aid at. And so, of course, the registry is intended to do what you weren't able to do with regard to that letter, which is identify a party that we can serve and we can communicate with. Now, those property maintenance codes that already exist are going to be the same codes after the code passes, which I hope it does, as it will be before, but those standards will be more able to be enforced because we can identify and serve the owner of the property. You're concerned about grandfather provisions. Of course, the International Property Maintenance Code, as most every building code does, has some provisions that say if a property was compliant with when it was constructed with the building code, then it's grandfathered in, and new building codes that provide stricter standards don't apply to that property until and unless that property is renovated to a certain degree or torn down and rebuilt or whatever. And that is true of building codes, the maintenance codes that already exist, no doubt. However, you should understand, though, that when those grandfather clauses are written in those codes that create those standards, they don't deal with health safety issues. They aren't
Habitability.
habitability issues. That's right, because you could go back many editions of probably every building code that is existent and still find the standard. If you have to provide electricity, you have to provide a roof, you have to provide, you can't have exposed wires and so forth and so on. So I don't imagine that there's not going to be a property that has a failing roof and floor and doesn't have hot water that can use as the excuse that we're grandfathered in.
Right. So here is my one concern, that it's not in here, and maybe it doesn't need to be in here. Maybe it simply needs to state that codes, that those are already available. But my concern is communication to the tenant of what is required of a landlord. Okay. That yes, you do have to have an intent, do have to have heat. Yes, there must be potable water. I'm going to tell people here renting in the city probably don't know it, can't find it. If I'm having difficulty, and I think I'm a pretty smart cookie, I'm having difficulty going through this ordinance, someone who has less than that ability needs to have it spelled out. This is what your rights are. This is what your responsibilities are. And if that needs to be part of every contract, I mean, everybody writes their own rental agreement, but they should have to provide that to their tenants. Okay. Now, one thing that does concern me, because you're telling me the cost of doing inspections up front isn't manageable because we don't have the staff. But then you also said if we addressed as many complaints as you've had now, they'd be working forever. So how are we addressing that? If we're going to put this in place, seems to me that you're going to get more complaints, okay, than you already have, potentially. And if you don't have adequate staff to address it, I mean, some of these things can't wait for a month or two. And then what happens to, say you pull a permit on a place, say, it's got so many things that those people shouldn't be in there. They've already signed a contract and they've paid whatever money they happen to have to get in this place, rent a truck or whatever they have to do, take a day off of work. And then the permit's gone for the landlord. How does the tenant get moved? Who takes care of that? Because I'm sorry, that's a big burden for somebody who doesn't have a lot of money, which is probably a lot of folks who rent.
Yes, ma'am. I don't think I've disagreed with anything you're saying there, Ms. Niebert. I would only say with regard to the limitations on inspections that, the city has financial constraints, and we no doubt there's crime that will occur in this city that we don't have officers there at the scene when it occurs, Chief. And if we had twice as many police officers, we could enforce the law better. If we had twice as many members of the fire department, Chief, we could probably respond quicker. And I don't say that frivolously or to make light of it. I say that to say, as a policymaker, we can't make the perfect the enemy of the good. Right now, Ms. Niebert, unfortunately, we have a situation where we have codes enforcement folks that get calls from folks. They know that what the people are calling about is violation of the law. The person who's calling knows it's a violation of the law. And we've not been able to enforce the existing law because we don't know who that property owner is. And we don't have a way of serving them. This is intended to address that. It won't fix it completely, no doubt. And there will still be slumlords, and chief, there's still going to be drug dealers. But hopefully the city, by achieving this, will improve that situation better than it is today. I know that's a not particularly satisfying answer, Ms. Niebert, but it's the reality of public policy.
Well, okay, I understand that. But this is coming from a resident who watched us beg in this neighborhood to get what little bit of park equipment that we did. But now we're going to be building all these lovely new sports centers. I know the city needs to grow because otherwise it's not going to be a place that you want to live. But if you put down rules and don't have some intention of having a way to enforce them, what's the point? Okay, we have I think two right now, people who are your codes enforcement. And if this is going to get added to their plate, I don't know how they're ever going to get any real codes enforcement done.
And I don't want to belabor this, and I know council is tired of hearing me monologue.
Yeah, so.
But and no doubt we'll have to hire more individuals. That's true. But the reality is, and remember, I'm perhaps among the strongest advocates for this action, but we simply cannot hire enough people to do inspections.
Well, even if you don't do that, you're still going to have somebody who can respond when there are real
yes, ma'am.
threat issues, not just two people. Two people can't cover the city size. And you're talking about, you've just voted to annex another area. I mean, really? You don't have enough, and so we've got to do that. So it's got to maybe make the next priority over something that beautifies the city.
Yes, ma'am.
Because if you don't have the infrastructure, you got a problem. So my biggest concern is that I think the tenants have been left out of this conversation and seem to still be left out of the equation.
Mr. Mayor.
The city manager has risen to speak, and I know Councilman Jabali would like to. Well, if please
go ahead. Yeah, I'm finished. I'm done.
Thank you, Mr. City Manager.
Mr. Mayor, Council, just to clear up any confusion, we are not planning on enforcing this ordinance without the addition of staff. We have researched, and we expect at least 2 or 3 new hires to be added to the program in order to enforce this. So you're very correct when you say we don't have the manpower to do inspections every time a lease changes. However, we fully anticipate and expect that we will hire and maintain an adequate staff to deal with the ordinance as written and in order to adequately enforce it.
Good.
Mayor. Mr. Mayor.
Yes, sir, please.
So, ma'am.
Yes.
Thank you. First off, thank you for speaking up. And let me just address your overall concern about tenants' issues not being taken into consideration. The whole purpose of this document, the entire purpose of the driving force behind this ordinance as a whole, is specifically because of so many concerns from so many people about the rental properties and the disrepair. So that's the whole motivation for doing this to begin with. If all the landlords were keeping their properties up beautifully, and if there were no issues, then we would be dealing with the different circumstances. So that's the driving force behind this, and we're trying to get it as good as we can. The second point about the hiring, as the city manager pointed out, the hiring of the different personnel to do the work, the business license fees and the fees that are going to be generated, that's some separate funding that will be able to help hire some additional people that we need to have hired. So that's built into the ordinance as the city manager just identified. So I hope
Good.
those help to address some of the concerns. And I hope you understand the reason behind this entire effort to begin with is because we've heard from.
I'm very of this. I just quite as far as it could.
I understand. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mrs. Davis, I know we have some other folks perhaps waiting. We have Mr. Gary Dausch with us. Mr. Dausch. Mrs. Davis, I know we have some other folks perhaps waiting. Gary, are you with? We have Gary Dausch with us. Dausch.
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. We can hear you. Gary, if you'll turn down your YouTube to prevent the feedback loop that occurs if you.
I've got it turned down. Is that better?
Thank you. Yes, sir. We can hear you, Mr. Dausch.
Okay. I don't want to, I know you guys have had a long meeting so far, and I don't want to spend too much time rehashing things we've already talked about, but my name is Gary Dausch. I'm a realtor. I'm also a rental property owner, and I am against this proposal, the ordinance. I feel that it's an unnecessary interference by the city. Specifically, I'm against the business license fee. I feel like it's just another tax being levied against us to raise money for the city. You know, and it's frustrating to see that coming when you see the city actively spending millions of dollars downtown, buying up properties and giving out of town investors incentives and all these other reasons to develop here. And meanwhile, we've been developing here for years, and you know, we just seem to get taxed to death. I feel the timing of this was unfortunate. It feels like it was politically timed. That it's trying to get it rushed in while COVID is preventing us from meeting in person. I feel like it would be easy for you guys to just sort of dismiss people complaining over a Zoom call, more so than a room full of people downtown. So I wish that we could delay this and have some actual public hearings, but I know it's difficult right now. As a rental property owner, I mean, that's mainly the way I make my livelihood. I feel like we're already paying a disproportionately high amount of property tax, and I know that's not something that you guys created, but I hope you're aware of it, and maybe we take that into consideration before adding more taxes on us. I just as a property owner and rental property developer, I feel like that the city and the county sort of looks at rental property as this endless, bottomless trough of tax dollars that you can just pull money from, and it's really getting to the point where it's difficult to make a profit in this business. And ultimately, if this thing passes, then I don't see any way that rent will not go up. I mean, it's just going to get passed along to the people, the tenants, and I feel like those are the ones that can afford it the least. Those are my feelings on the issue. If you want to ask me questions, I'd be happy to hear them.
Thank you, Mr. Dausch. Thank you for being with us.
All right. Thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Mr. Dave, that's the conclusion of the folks who have called in. Very well. All right, that we have spoken with everyone who's called in and talked to us about this issue. We talked a little bit just a minute ago about the procedure, and I think that the way to proceed on this thing, we've had first reading of this ordinance in September. I would ask first if there is a motion and second on the September version, then if we do receive motions, then proceed to accept motions on any amendments, and then concluding determinations of any amendments, then we'll have a reading on passage of the ordinance as amended or not amended, if that makes sense to everyone. Very well. Is there a motion and a second? There's a motion by Councilwoman Gibson High Moore. Is there a second? Second by Councilwoman. I'm sorry?
Second.
Second. So there's been a motion by Councilwoman Moore and a second by Irvin. Now, we have, and just so we're all clear precisely, and George made a reference to this, and I want to make sure we all understand exactly what the amendments are and what amendments are before us. There was a draft, a first draft of an amendment that was shared with council by Mr. Peterson in response to Mr. Finkley's concerns that were expressed at the September reading and before the September reading. That was what I'll call, for lack of a better term, the first draft amendment. And this, I believe, Mr. Peterson, was circulated to members of council, including myself, on October the 5th, Monday, which followed that September meeting. Okay. At this point, I move that we amend the ordinance that was passed first reading in September so as to read as the amendment that was circulated on Monday, October 5th. Now, before we take that up, I recognize that folks may want to amend that, right? And so let's vote on that amendment, and then we'll vote on subsequent amendments if that's fair. So that's my motion, to amend the ordinance as the draft of Monday, October 5th. Is there a second? I couldn't hear, I'm sorry. There's a second by Councilwoman Irvin. Am I right?
Yes.
There's been a motion and second as to amending the September version to read as the October 5th version. Okay. There's been a motion.
Mayor.
Councilman Jabali, discussion.
Yes, I would move to amend the amendment that you're going to be making here to the most recent version that Mr. Peterson submitted today, to include the language presented by Gary Finkley that we heard from earlier today, speaking specifically to section 4-9043.
I second.
All right. So, wait a second. Wait a second. Procedurally, Jim, do we take up the vote on the first motion before we take up?
No, we didn't.
Or how do I do that procedure? I'm sorry.
I keep forgetting that I'm not near a microphone over there. I think procedurally what you do is you now have a motion to amend on the floor, and then a motion to amend the amendment. Once the motions are finished, then you take them in reverse order.
I got you.
You start off with the motion to amend the amendment, then you go to the motion to amend, and you move back towards the original one.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you. Very well. So what is currently before us is the motion to amend the amendment. The amendment that I move is the October 5th first draft. The motion to amend that amendment is Mr. Jabali's motion. And as I understand it, Mr. Jabali, that pertains to what we've now determined is 904.3.
No, it is the amended version. What my motion to amend the amendment is the version that Mr. Peterson sent out today, as opposed to the October 5 version. But I'm just clear that the version that was sent out today needs to include the most recent language that Mr. Finkley submitted, which Mr. Peterson commented on. That is 904.3. So it's today's version of the amendment that Councilwoman Gibson High Moore has seconded, that would include Mr. Finkley's language change. That's the amendment to the amended motion.
But the language you're referring to from Mr. Finkley is the language that pertains to 904.3.
Correct.
And that language is not in there was an email that was circulated from Jim Friday, which is the October 9th version, I'll call it. Am I right?
Then there was another one today.
All right.
The one that I handed out here, Mayor, that last version that he's referring to shows the changes from that Friday version that were done literally about 10 minutes before this meeting started. And it tracks the changes from the one that was sent out on Friday.
Correct.
Your motion, Councilman Jabali, is to adopt the version that was handed to us when we walked in this meeting that was circulated by Jim when we walked in this meeting.
Yes.
And
That
I'm sorry.
is correct. That is correct.
And that,
Well, then I take my second back because I want the one that was sent out Friday, not the one today.
Well, I would ask before you do that, that Mr. Peterson be allowed to comment on, there were just a few minor changes to it. And
Yes, Mr. Peterson, I want clarity before I
Yes,
give that second.
absolutely. We addressed one of them, but there are a couple of others. And so I agree with you. If we could have clarity on those minor changes that were made, Jim, if you could speak to those.
Well, I certainly can do that, and I'll just go section by section. I think there are about 4 or 5 changes that I think I can highlight very quickly. The first change is in section 4-904. And you will see that it's entitled Responsibilities of Property Owner, Responsible Local Representative. And we took out the word "and occupant." And the reason for that is, you'll see in just a moment, we moved this information about the responsibilities of the occupants to a later section. The next change was the paragraph 4-904(2), which again dealt with occupancy violations. And you see that that's stricken from this version. Not that it's gone, it's also moved later, and I will cover that in just a moment. The next change, just going in order, is the added language that Councilman Jabali referenced that would go at the end of 4-904(3). That additional language that we went over verbatim earlier that Mr. Finkley recommended would go at the end of subparagraph 3, right there. The next change is in section 4-905(3). And this is the one that I referred to earlier. This change is made to make it clear that the only criminal violation of this particular ordinance would be operating a residential rental unit as defined in this ordinance without the required rental permit. So it takes all of the other sections of this ordinance out of the criminal enforcement, but it specifically leaves as criminal enforcement the operation of a rental unit without the required permit. Along with that change, the subparagraph was 4 under there was stricken because it also referenced criminal activity. The next change, and the biggest change from the standpoint of number of words, is under subparagraph 8 of that same section. And this is where we pick up occupancy violations. And I'll give you an example. Let's say the zoning laws applicable to where a unit is located does not allow more than 5 unrelated people within that residence. That would be a zoning occupancy violation if somebody was violating that. The new section 8, and I think the best way for me to go over this is simply to read it. It's about 3 sentences. It says, both the Unified Development Ordinance and the International Property Maintenance Code address occupancy and use limitations. Occupants are directly responsible for occupancy violations. Responsible representatives and owners are secondarily responsible for occupancy violations. In the event of an occupancy violation, the city will follow the notice of violation procedure set out in section 4-906 by serving both occupants and the owner and/or responsible representative. If the occupancy violation is not resolved pursuant to the notice of violation with the occupants, the city of Florence shall then serve the owner, responsible representative with a second notice of violation of occupancy violation and provide the appropriate information confirming the violation in order to provide the owner and/or responsible representative the opportunity to resolve the matter. That's additional language which is setting up a procedure that if an occupancy violation occurs, we send a notice of violation to both the tenants and the owner or responsible representative. If it's not resolved, we then notify the owner and responsible representative that it has not been resolved. The process being an occupancy violation is normally a violation by tenants. They've moved in another family or they've put in additional people. There's now too many people in the unit, for example. So we give them the opportunity to correct it. If it's not corrected, then we give the owner responsible party the opportunity to correct it. And it's only at that point that we proceed with our same procedure that's already in the ordinance to move forward if the violation has not been corrected.
Let me make sure I understand, Jim. What you're talking about is the amendment that Councilman Jabali has offered, and it varies from the amendment I've offered in that it limits the criminal responsibility of the owner, and it increases the service requirements under certain circumstances.
Under certain circumstances, yes.
On that basis, I oppose it, but it's been moved by Councilman Jabali. Is there a second? Very well. Hearing no second, that motion to amend fails. Is there any other motion?
Can I ask for clarification?
Councilwoman.
And I hate to use Gary's the Friday one and the one today. The one today is what I understand to be.
You say that again. We just lost you for a second.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No.
I think Councilmember Pat Gibson had referred to the Friday version and then Councilman today's version. My understanding of today's version was what Gary Finkley submitted on behalf of his organization. Is that correct?
No, Mr. Peterson's going to address it.
You know, Gary sent some proposed changes, some of which we as a staff could live with and recommend, some of which we couldn't.
Right.
Unfortunately, and I'm gathering that maybe this didn't happen, as I was leaving all of this happened within 30, 45 minutes of when our council meeting was set to start. And as I was leaving my office, I asked folks to send you all the last version. I was able to get the version over to staff so we could print them out, and we handed them out here. But my guess is that some of you council members don't have that last version. It's not the version as changed by Mr. Finkley. It's the version that reacted to the requested changes by Mr. Finkley. And since you all don't have it, perhaps I could run upstairs and get it scanned and sent to you right now. Those changes that I just went over are the only changes that were to the version you got on Friday. If you take the version you got on Friday and note the changes I just went over, those are the only changes from Friday.
Mr. Mayor, I'd move for a recess to allow for Mr. Peterson and staff to send out so that everybody will have had a chance to see the changes that Mr. Peterson is identified, and that we can then take a look at specifically to addressing Councilwoman Williams-Blake's question. So I move for a recess.
I second.
All right, well, we'll recess for how long you think it'll take? 5 minutes, 10 minutes?
Well, I mean, it won't take us long to scan it and send it.
Unless there's objection, let's recess for 10 minutes and we'll return at 3:35. No, without objection, we'll recess until 3:35.
Thank you.
I'm gonna go through the whole list. I'll do it very
Not
quickly.
quickly, no.
I listen, I don't want it to be demerited, buddy.
No.
Yeah, will you take that to Renee? I'll call you when I'm finished.
You did pretty good, that lady. Oh, my Lord, we're talking hours here.
I can't.
You did, you handled it really well.
You can set it on, like, yeah,
Okay,
that's the center of that, you know.
All right, who are we liking? We like Glenn and George.
There's Glenn.
There's Glenn. All right, Councilman JaVale.
There he is.
All right, yep. We're about to be live.
Go out, you know, with Drew.
We didn't go out, but we could, there's a really good place called Food Matters in Brevard. It's a grocery store,
Mhm.
but it's all locally stuff and, you know, very good, high quality stuff.
Mhm.
And so, when I've done before, typically we'll go over there, particularly since I'm butting in on him and I'm bringing people, and I'll buy food, prepare, and then he'll cook it. And so we bought some trout, local
Mhm.
trout,
Mhm.
super
I bet
good,
that was good.
and just stuff like that. And so we ate very, very well.
She spent 2 nights. Huh?
Oh, well, I say that. One day we did go to lunch while we were out, when we were out buying that stuff.
Mhm.
We went to lunch and went over to
What's that? Oh gosh, I know
not
that.
Sierra
Not
Nevada.
Sierra Nevada.
No, it was in
Different
another
one.
one, yeah. And it was right in Brevard. And
That's Sierra Nevada thing, Bruce. Pretty
Oh,
cool. Yeah.
I've never, well, I drove by it one time.
Jan and I went in there one time. It was unreal. But there's probably a couple of them up there now. I bet.
Are we
What's been the one at St. Louis at House Bush?
No.
Oh. I went there about 25 years ago when I first joined AGA. Gosh, 30 years ago now. Man, I got to beat August Bush the third.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it was real.
That's cool.
I got a mug that he actually signed for me sitting in my office. Yeah.
It's the same slot in the corner.
And it wasn't about brewing beer, but that was one of the elements of it. I can't remember what the. Anyway, it talked about how, particularly in Germany, every brewer, every town, little town has its own local brewer.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of how I.
Well, kind of like what's going back now with all these things, the IPAs. And
that's right.
These little places that are
And they
doing
didn't
microbreweries. That's what.
Microbreweries, and they didn't have pasteurization. They didn't have good refrigeration, anything like that.
Mhm.
So if you were going to have beer, you were having it from the local place,
Mhm.
and they all developed their own little taste and style and everything. And
That's kind of what's happening. That's almost come back.
And it's
again.
coming back again.
Yeah.
But that all those technologies, refrigeration, pasteurization, all that stuff made it possible all of a sudden for you to produce beer one place and then ship it all over the world. You know?
My son Carter, when he got his first job at MUSC out of college, he was looking for a place to stay. And he's a smart little kid. He got this place in North Charleston. It's not north of Charleston downtown, but it's right across from the Palmetto Brewery where they have all these different things. He said, well, all I got to do is walk across the street.
Yeah.
You don't have to worry about driving. I said, that's pretty
I
smart.
wish I could remember the name of this one. But Drew said it was kind of outside of downtown Brevard. Out of the way. And Drew said that this guy came in and he wanted to go into downtown Brevard, but he wanted to put up this big can.
Mm-hmm.
Like it was an advertising thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And they wouldn't let him do that.
Downtown wouldn't let him do it, yeah.
And so it's fine. I'll go out, and then he went outside of downtown and he was
YouTube. Having a problem with YouTube again.
All right, folks, we are being held up by YouTube. We will resume your programming shortly. Oscar Blue. Thank you.
You would know that he knew that, right? Sure.
Yeah, and it was fantastic. And so, but it's like Clint knows, it's a metal structure. Ain't nothing fancy about it. And then outside of the structure, they just have picnic tables and stuff. And I think Drew said because of the COVID, they really kind of improved the little picnic area. It wasn't fancy, but there's a long bar that runs along it. And so you go up, there's a line, you go up, you order your beer and your food. You go sit down, they go over to a food truck and then they cook your hamburger or whatever. And it was out of this world, man. The burger was great. And
they just have several different kinds of beer.
They had a ton of beers.
A ton of different kinds.
Yeah. Oscar Blue. Yeah.
There's one in Colorado, Brevard, and now in Austin.
And wasn't he, I think Drew told me that maybe he was a local guy, had gone to Colorado and been successful and just decided he was going to do one in Brevard or something like that. I mean, he started in Colorado.
He's a big mountain biker.
Mountain biker.
Started coming out.
Yeah.
to Western North
Oh,
Carolina.
okay, that's what brought, it was something that didn't have anything to do with
Mhm.
brewing beer. Yeah. And so now they've built, there's a trail, they built the trail kind of over, I don't know if the trail existed there when he went there or whether they built the trail up to him, but.
I think they built it
To
when
him.
when he got there. He owns a brand, a mountain bike brand as well. It's called Reeb, which is beer backwards.
But it's, it's not dissimilar from, what's happening over there behind, Naturally Outdoors.
Yeah.
And those guys
Those
going
guys,
over there,
locomotive truck,
locomotive
yeah.
guys going over there. I'll tell you, man, that coffee place they have, every
you
time
been
I've
in
been by
there?
there, it's been packed.
Yeah.
It's pretty good.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And it's well done. You
Mhm.
know, it's the way they built it's attractive.
That's where we're going to spend that money from Duke to extend the
To
trail.
extend the bike, yeah. Yeah, they haven't, if you ever been, Greenville has the Swamp Rabbit Trail.
Yeah, that's amazing.
It really is. And they have a, Clint, what's the name, or Jim, you might know, of that little place that's right at the end of this, or one end of the Swamp Rabbit Trail that's not just
The grocery.
the little grocery
And
thing?
it is Swamp Rabbit Cafe.
Yeah. Okay. It's very,
Same
very,
kind of thing.
yeah, not fancy picnic tables. You know, you go up and order your food and people are coming by, going on the trail. And
It has really blown up.
Yeah.
And that trail has redeveloped properties that you would otherwise would have never redeveloped.
Right.
I've got a buddy, John Montgomery, who you may know John Montgomery. He's a developer in Spartanburg. And he, in fact, somehow he's connected with Chris Seal Scott. He knows, I can't remember how he knows Seal, but I think maybe they went to school together or something. Anyway, he was telling me he's been real into trails and stuff and has been really involved in buying easements and stuff and real estate to extend Spartanburg's Trail. And he has spent an ungodly amount of money on it. And when I first, he's one of the Liberty Fellows. And when I first got to know him in that, he was talking about how jealous he was of us because we had so many railroad right of ways that existed.
And that's what he used for his trail.
Well, he couldn't. He had to buy,
Just
land. Buy land and buy easements.
Mm-hmm.
And we didn't, have to do that as much anyway. And but he has spent a lot of money.
I think they're about to connect those.
Are they going to connect? He had said that was his plan, but I didn't know that they were getting close to that.
Once something like that, those things take 20 years
Oh yeah.
to get moving. But then once people find the equity and they see everything that
Clint, how many miles is our trail
we
system right now?
have 20, how many miles do we have, Chuck? 22 miles?
Well, then it becomes not unlike the Swamp Rabbit Cafe.
Right.
All of a sudden now this is a valuable commodity. You're pushing a pretty good volume of people through there who have disposable income and many of them. I remember when I was in DC, there was always a big political fight over where a metro stop would go.
Because of how much that
Well,
generated.
you put a metro stop somewhere,
Just like an intersection.
it's just like an intersection. All of a sudden, the real estate around that stop becomes very valuable.
They got people.
I mean, that's what you look for an apartment in DC and it says 2 blocks from such and such metro.
Metro
That's the selling point. Yeah. Really? I mean,
There you go.
That's no joke, man. I mean,
And you were the cook.
That's right.
Yep.
We're gonna apply for Florida. No way.
Yeah.
That's a pretty ritzy town, but they got some serious money.
The Brevard's an interesting place. Isn't it? I mean, the downtown Brevard is really, Drew and I were talking about, we're walking through downtown Brevard, and Brevard's got to be, Brevard is maybe half the population of this.
Maybe.
I mean, it's
very small.
Pretty small, but the downtown is just out of this world. I mean,
It was old blacksmithing town.
Yes, yeah.
All right. Go with it before we lose it again.
All right. Are we live?
We are.
All right. We are live, ladies and gentlemen. Sorry for the technical delay, but we're back live. Just so we review the bidding here. So at our September meeting, we passed first reading of the rental registry ordinance. At that time, Mr. Gary Finkley, representing himself and a number of other interested individuals, had provided council with a variety of comments on that ordinance and requests for changes. Mr. Peterson and city staff, Mr. Moore and Mr. Ostman and others, Scott, had been working on preparing a proposed amendment to be recommended by staff to council. And at that point, it wasn't going to be ready for the September meeting. And I asked council to pass the ordinance as it stood on first reading with the expectation and anticipation that their work would be completed soon and that they'd be able to offer a draft to us that was their recommendation for an amendment. They did do so. And on Monday, October the 5th, this is the Monday following that Monday regular meeting. No, that wasn't a regular meeting. Monday following that meeting. Mr. Peterson sent out to all of us on October 5th a draft of a proposed amendment. That is the draft that I have moved adoption by this council as the amendment. And it's been seconded. Since that time, Mr. Finkley has continued to make recommendations, including sending stuff today. And Mr. Peterson, at the request of members of council, have drafted up a variety and sent those out. Of course, anybody is at liberty on this council to offer whatever amendment they will. But the amendment that I offer and that I recommend and that's before us right now and it's been seconded is that amendment that was the product of that work by staff and Mr. Peterson that was sent out on October the 5th. I think that encapsulates best the intent of this council. And I don't support any amendments after that date because frankly, I just think they add more confusion and don't particularly add much to the quality of this ordinance. So what's before this council is that October 5th amendment that's been moved and seconded. We're at appropriate point now for any further discussion. Any further discussion from members? Very well. Hearing no discussion.
Mr. Mayor?
I'm sorry, Councilman Dwelly, I'm sorry.
That's okay. I would ask Mr. Peterson if he's available to have a question for him.
Mr. Peterson, Mr. Jabali has a question.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Peterson, I understand that prior to the October 5, you had been unavailable out of town for a few days and then came back in on October 5. And then during the week of last week, you were working with staff to make additional improvements to the ordinance. And the document that was sent out on the 9th was one that you and staff, I think, had spent a considerable amount of time reviewing and going over prior to sending that out on the afternoon on the 9th. Is that right?
That is generally correct. The one that went out on October the 5th was in response to the first comments made by Mr. Finkley. And then after we sent that out on October the 5th, then we got additional comments from Mr. Finkley that came to us, and my memory may fail me. I think they came to us on Thursday, either late Wednesday or Thursday of last week. So the October 9th version was a version attempting to take into account the additional comments. When we sent the October 5th version out to council, we also sent it to Mr. Finkley and to any others who had expressed an interest in it. So we then got response on the October 5th, and that's what generated the October 9th version that went out last Friday. Then this morning, we received other comments, these being comments to the October 9th version from Mr. Finkley. And then the one that you all now have that we've been referring to as the most recent version were an effort to react to the additional comments.
If I'm, just to be clear, all along the way, there were other requests made that you as attorney and staff did not feel were appropriate and were not included in any of the revisions. Is that right?
That is correct.
And so what we have in front of us in the most recent version, as we're calling the one that came today, is the version that incorporates the modifications and changes that you and staff feel are appropriate, that address the issues and keep things as intended with this whole process from the beginning, and is designed to streamline the process and clarify, but did not make changes where staff and you felt like they were inappropriate.
There were certainly requests that we felt could not be incorporated into the document and still stay purposeful for what we understood we were trying to accomplish with the document. So the changes that were made were changes that I, as the attorney, and staff felt could be made if they were council's wishes and still remain honest and purposeful to the big goals of the ordinance.
And so that's what was just, we took this pause a short while ago, and that most recent document that was sent out is the most recent version that includes the changes that both you and city staff felt would be appropriate.
Yes, that most recent version was our changes to the October 9th version that we felt comfortable in incorporating, and those changes were made in about a 20-minute period. We got that request at about, as I recall, about 12:15 or so, and we made those changes. Could be off a little bit, but we quickly went through the requested changes and ran them through staff very quickly. And then that last version was our best effort to respond.
And that's the changes, the most recent version of the changes to the October 9 version.
That is correct. That most recent version that everybody got is a clean copy of the October 9 version with tracks, markings showing any changes made to the October 9 version.
And just so I'm clear, this rental registry was, we have been moving very, very quickly from the time it was first presented to council for a work session and then a first reading, and now in a very short period of time for something that is very comprehensive. And of course, we're in a COVID world and trying to deal with matters like this. I appreciate council's, input, as well as staff's input and your input and citizen input into the whole process. But normally we would have much more time to address these things. And I think that's one of the concerns that's been raised. And to, I think, your credit and staff's credit, there has been a great effort to try to improve the ordinance all along the way. And the final question with regard to this most recent one, is there anything in this most recent version that either you or staff are objecting to or feel is inappropriate that is in there?
Now, I want to say something. I want to interrupt you, Jim, for a second. That this points to the issue. We must recall, and we must be careful with regard to administration and staff, to not put them in a position where we're asking their policy view or their vote on a particular policy of city council. There are policy choices and there are drafting choices. The amendment that I have offered represents my policy choices, and I believe represents the policy choices of a majority of members of council. Those who have views that have different policy views on this council, that's what we're about, is to offer competing policy views. But what's inappropriate and out of line is to try to put staff in a position where, because they've drafted something, you ask if that represents their policy view. That's not,
Mr. Mayor, that is not what I'm asking.
let me finish. And here's why and this is, look, I'm on my way out, but this is a statement for the future. That's not fair to staff, because they can't be even-handed to the members of council if they're asked to choose sides and they're asked to express policy views. Mr. Peterson would never do that. Mr. Osterman would never do that. None of our staff would ever do that. And they've never been asked to do that.
Mr. Mayor, that's not what I'm asking. That's not what I'm asking. What I'm asking is simply, is there anything in there that anybody has objected to that's still in there? And if the answer is yes, then we need to identify what's objectionable. If no, then because we have not had a chance to dialogue this at length, and here we are in a relatively rushed environment in a COVID world, this is just a very straightforward question to see if there's anything in this most recent version or in the earlier October 9 version that was objectionable.
Well, I'd like to respond to that, Councilman, to say the most recent version has a limitation of criminal liability for landowners and landlords, and I object to it. And I'm a policymaker. Now, whether the majority of the council feels that way, I don't know. But that's the way I feel, and that's the way I don't support it.
And I appreciate that you can certainly differ and others can differ on that point. So that was the question. And that's my question to Mr. Peterson. Is there any element to it that they are objecting to that is still in there? So it's not asking them to do it. So Mr. Peterson, I'd ask that again.
Yeah, obviously, as you all know, my job as the city attorney is to look at a document, try to draft it to accomplish what our instructions are to accomplish. I'm proud to say that I don't get a vote. So what we tried to do is simply take the comments and do them in a way that, first of all, we felt were legal, that there was no legal objection to them. And secondly, that we felt, based on our understanding of what we were, the big picture of what we were trying to accomplish with the ordinance, we felt this was still accomplishing the big picture. But that's why we point out what the changes were. Obviously, the changing from criminal liability on certain issues to non-criminal liability are issues that ultimately are a policy decision. We don't make those. What we didn't want to do as a staff and as a city attorney, because we had been trying to work through comments that were coming in, is we didn't want to ignore the comments and just say, we're just not going to do anything. So our effort was trying to say, okay, can we lawfully do this? And then we make changes that tried to accomplish and recognize the comments, while at the same time pointing out what those changes were so council ultimately can make the policy decisions.
So just to be clear, the change that you're referring to that has been mentioned about the criminal change, the criminal responsibility aspect of it, that's in the most recent change, not the October 9 version.
That is correct.
Okay. The October 9 version did not address that language change that you've been talking about.
That is correct.
Okay. And the October 9 version did not address the occupancy piece of the pulling that out and making that separate.
That is also correct.
And is there can we just speak to that for one moment, please? The occupancy and the rationale for pulling that out and treating that with that separate language. What's the value in that?
Our understanding is that the objection of Mr. Finkley and others, we had occupancy violations simply listed in the list of violations, which meant that if there was an occupancy violation, we would do a notice of violation. The owner and responsible representative would have an opportunity to correct it, as we've talked about in the notice of violation. And if it was not corrected, then it could move on through the administrative process and ultimately potentially result in the revocation of a permit. The change that was recommended, as we understood what the change was, and the language that's in here is not the exact language that Mr. Finkley recommended, but the gist of his recommendation was that occupancy violations in his mind are normally things done by the tenant. We're not talking about failure to maintain the building. We're talking about the way the residence is being occupied. And so he suggested, and what we incorporated was in essence one additional step. The additional step was an initial notice of violation that goes to the occupants, the tenants, and the owner and responsible representative. And with the idea that under that notice, the tenants are made aware of it, they have an opportunity to correct the problem. If it's not corrected, then the additional step was an additional notice of violation that went to the owner and responsible representative, basically saying this has not been corrected, you've got to take action to correct it. That was, again, was at their request. Those are obviously policy decisions. We tried to incorporate the request as best we could.
And so those requests are, those two are what changed 9 version to this most recent one from today.
Yes, there were other small changes that carried those out. In other words, there were word or two in other locations, but they were all related to those two changes.
Everything else in the most recent one is the same as in Friday version.
Yes, there are other, a good example is at section 4-904, where the title says responsibilities of property owner, responsible local representative. There used to be the word and occupant there. Just structurally, we moved the information on the occupants to a later point in the ordinance. It didn't take that language out, it simply moved it.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Peterson. I appreciate that. At this time, I would,
Question.
yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Mr. Peterson, I just listened to what you said, and I just want to make sure I kind of understand. It doesn't sound like there are major substantive issues between the October 5th and the October 9th. I heard you say about occupancy, you would send a letter to both the occupant and the owner, and that's something that could be done as a process, but are there major changes between the 5th and the 9th other than clarifications?
There were other changes between the 5th and the 9th. I can go over those changes. They were made in response to the first set of comment.
Right.
This is actually the second set of comments.
Yeah.
And you know, they weren't huge changes, but the changes I was just talking about were changes from October the 9th until today.
Today, right. But I was just referring to between the 5th and the 9th, because the motion that's on the floor is for the October 5th.
That is correct. And I can go grab a copy of that, and I think I can sort of take you through that. Clint's just handed me one. Of course, when you got the October 9th version, the version you got tracks all of the changes from the October 5th version. So,
and I reviewed all of those, but I didn't see many substantive changes. It was mostly clarifications.
I think that's probably a good summary of them. They were clarification type changes. A good example is 4901 6, where we changed sort of the structure. It didn't end up changing the number of days. It was still, 120 days, but we broke it up into a 90-day period and a 30-day period. And a lot of the changes there were changes to clarify. We had comments. A good example is comments saying, are you sure this ordinance is clear that the $25 fee applies per application, that you can cover the $25 fee, can cover multiple permits? It's all by application, which was what we had been saying all along. We felt it was clear, but we felt by adding a couple of sentences, we could make it crystal clear. And so there were clarifications like that through it.
And just one follow-up, because for me, it's important to make sure that we have listened to the public's comments and have tried to incorporate their concerns into the revisions or amendments. And what I'm hearing you say and what I understand is that those public comments were taken into consideration in the October 5th version.
Yes, the original comments that Mr. Finkley sent I think actually on the day of our September 30th meeting, those comments were taken into account to draft the October 5th version.
Yes, okay.
Then we got additional comments that we took into account to generate the October 9th version.
Yes, okay. That provides me the clarity I need. Thank you.
Councilwoman Moore.
You're on mute, Pat.
You're muted.
You're on mute.
Unless it's a city-owned property, we don't have a contract with any tenant, do we? Only the landlord has a contract with the tenant.
That's certainly correct.
Okay, we don't have a contract with the tenant. Why would we issue a notice of violation to the tenant? Shouldn't we issue it to the landlord and the landlord can issue it to the tenant? We have no rights to that property unless it's owned by the city of Florence.
That certainly could be a policy decision made by council. Just like, for example, if there was a violation that involved criminal activity in the unit, which is covered in another section, we certainly would have the authority, I believe, legally, to issue a notice of violation that put both the tenants and the owner on notice. I'm telling you, that's the only way it could be done. Certainly, we could take the approach, as you mentioned, that what we're going to do is put the owner on notice and leave it up to them to communicate with the tenant. I think that's a policy decision that you guys need to make.
Jim, can I just, Councilman Jabali, do you mind if I just respond to
By all means,
council members? Ms. Pat, I'm calling you Ms. Pat. So I know that an ordinance cannot address every single step that the staff can take. I mean, this ordinance would be 200 pages if we did that. So we're trying to provide the broad policy and intent of what we're trying to accomplish with the registry, but whether they send a letter to the owner and the occupant or just the occupant, that can be a process that the city implements.
And
right?
I understand it's a process, but we're at the same time, we're trying to protect not only the landlord, but also the tenant.
No, but Pat, I'm supporting what you're saying in saying that they can make that decision to send it to both or just the owner, but we don't have to debate that in the actual ordinance.
I like the wording. I like the wording better from the October 5th, because I don't see the point of that tenant's not giving us a cent.
Right.
They're not paying us a dime. I don't see the purpose of us going after them. It's up to the landlord should be going after them for their violations, not
Right.
us. It's not if it's not a criminal violation.
So, Mr. Mayor.
Councilman.
So having heard these comments regarding the most recent changes to that, I would move to amend your amended motion to have it be the October 9th one that everybody has had since Friday and had a chance to look at, that I think Mr. Peterson said provided some clarifications, but did not include the occupancy piece that we've been discussing here recently that Councilwoman Gibson High Moore had raised as a concern of notifying the tenant, which I completely understand. And I think that makes perfect sense to me. So I would move to amend to the October 9 one that was sent out on Friday, that I think everybody's had a chance to look at.
All right, very well. There's a motion to amend before council, which is the October 5th version that I've moved and has been seconded. Councilman Jabali moves to amend the October 5th version to the October 9th version, for lack of a better term. That's his motion. Is there a second?
Matter of discussion, I will second that.
Very well. There's been a second by Councilman Willis. Any further discussion on the October 9th version? For the record, I oppose the October 9th version for the reasons that have already been stated by Councilwoman Moore and to some extent by the comments raised by Councilwoman Williams-Blake. I think the October 5th version represents our effort to incorporate the concerns of Mr. Finkley, and that I think that adding these other elements in October 9th are unnecessary and confusing, and so I would oppose.
Well, for Mr. Mayor, as Mr. Peterson identified, the October 9 one did nothing more, no substantive changes, but just clarified. For instance, one of the things it clarified was under section 901(3), it talked about, the last sentence was added that said compliance with applicable codes includes units in compliance because they are grandfathered in due to their age or other reasons. In other words, so if someone has a property that is 30 years old, obviously it does not meet ADA and it doesn't meet the current codes. And so it simply clarifies that, you know, those properties that, you know, if someone has a house that was built 30 years ago and everything's great, the house is fine, everything's wonderful, nobody's got any problems, it doesn't mean that all of a sudden, if I, as a landlord, have to go in and do my own inspection and I have to certify that it meets code, that it meant meeting, it meant applied at the time. So that's just an example of a clarification. And I'm sorry, Jim, to have to keep calling you up, but if you would please, I'd like to ask you to address those clarifications in the October 9 version so that for the benefit of everyone on council, all can understand what those clarifications were. Thank you.
The first major change or changes on the October 9th one occurred in 4-901. And I'm going to call it change the structure of the language in 4-901 1 and 2 to clarify when the rental permit was required and to answer questions that had been posed to us. For example, the last sentence to that was added that says an application under this section can cover one permit for one residential rental unit, or it can cover multiple permits for multiple residential units. So the other thing that it did, and again, it didn't change the substance of it, but in the October 5th version, we had a separate section called 4-903, which covered the application. We simply moved that because of questions being asked into 4-901. That same language that was a separate section is now found in 4-901-2. It simply moved from a separate section into that. Another section that changed slightly was on the renewals. Again, we weren't trying to change it substantively, but if you look at the section on renewal of rental permits on your version, you'll see that we changed the language there, took some language out, and basically merged that with the next subsection, which was section 6, to clarify that renewal process and basically to answer in writing questions that were being posed to us. The next section, again, we don't think changed anything substantively, but the section the new section 4903(3) references the business licenses. And again, there were questions about what the end of that sentence meant. And so to clarify it, we changed the language a little bit to answer those questions. What used to be 4905 now is 4904 because, as I mentioned, we had eliminated 4903, had some changes. Again, we felt nothing designed to change the substance. It was basically making clearer information that we were already stating. And for example, the language at the end of 49043 that says nothing in this ordinance prohibits the owner, responsible representative, or tenant from contractually shifting responsibility of maintenance of the property if otherwise legally permissible. The owner and or responsible representative, however, will be the party ultimately responsible to the city for maintaining the property in compliance with the International Property Maintenance Code and the South Carolina Landlord Tenant Act. Again, we were getting questions about whether provisions in here were saying that they could not, that landlords couldn't in a lease shift maintenance requirements to the tenants. Of course, we were not. That was never the intent of this. That language was added just to make it crystal clear that we were not. One thing that was added is in the notice of violation process, which is found in 4-906, that we added a new section, which is section E, under 1E, which says that the notice will include a right to request an informal conference with the building official or city designee to discuss the violation for purposes of resolving the conditions giving rise to the notice. That's one of those things that we always anticipated, that when a landlord received a notice of violation, we certainly felt like they could call and say, can we talk about this? This formalized it because it was a question being asked. And it said that, yes, we would put in the notice that if you want to have an informal conversation with us about it to see if it can be resolved, we certainly had no objection to that. The next change that was related to that is in 4-908. And in that, we said that if that informal request was made, we extended the period for someone to appeal. You know, if that informal situation didn't work, you've got a notice of violation. The October 5th version said you've got 20 days to appeal to our board. This said, well, if you ask for that informal thing in recognition that that would take some time, we extended it by 10 days if you made that request prior to the deadline. In other words, you couldn't wait until after the 20 days and make the request, but if you made it during the 20 days. And those are the type changes that were made. There are a couple of others that, again, were clarification changes. One clarification was section 4-913 on criminal penalties. And there, the change that we made was one that made it clear that to be a criminal penalty, they had to not comply with the notice of violation. In other words, we weren't going to issue a summons and a notice of violation at the same time. But if they did not comply with a notice of violation, it gave the city the option to go the criminal route if it chose. And then the final change was one to 4-915, which covered the $25 application fee. And again, we added a sentence that just made it clear that that $25 application fee was per application and that the application could cover more than one permit.
So to summarize, these were multiple clarifications along the way and nothing substantive.
I think the only thing really substantive is that one point that I mentioned, and let me go back to it real quickly. Yeah, the addition of the informal process in the notice of violation process. Yeah, obviously that step didn't exist before in the ordinance, and it added that step.
And that's an extra 10 days.
Pardon me?
An extra 10 days.
Yeah, well, actually putting the requirement that we put in the notice of violation, the opportunity to have that informal discussion. And if you ask for the informal discussion, then the extra 10 days.
Okay. Thank you.
There's been a motion and a second for Councilman Jabali's amendment to the October 9th version. Ultimately, my objection to it is that I offer here in the October 5th version substantive amendments that were made in response to the request of the landlords through Mr. Finkley. Those requests continue for additional ones in October 9th and today, and I imagine will continue thereafter. My view is that the October 5th version is well-reasoned and is a fair compromise. There's been a motion and a second on Councilman Jabali's motion. Hearing no further discussion, all in favor, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Nay.
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 The Jabali amendment fails. What remains is the October 5th amendment that I've offered, is the amendment to the September 1st reading. All in favor of the October 5th amendment, indicate.
Mr. Mayor, I'd like to make an amendment to that.
Yes, sir.
My amendment be, and let me say this, I understand that I'm in the minority on my opinion about this, but the more I hear today from these conversations and from the citizens, there's a lot more needs to be done with this. This is a very important, critical matter to this city. I'd like to amend this motion to suspend action at this time on this matter until our local economy stabilizes, and for both residents and business owners. By doing this, we will allow more discussion time to occur. And let me just ask every one of my fellow council persons, what would this hurt to have more discussions? We're debating right now between the first revision and the last revision. And this is not who we are. I just don't understand why we're pushing this through the speed we're doing. And my last point, we heard today from both people, we're forgetting about the least of us that rent properties. And you better believe they're going to be affected. And what's going to happen to them? Well, what our business? Well, to me, it is our business. If we pass an ordinance that's going to cause people to be evicted because the rents are going up, and we each one of us voted to do this, then there should be some discussion what's going to happen to these people. So, and like I said, I know I'm in the minority. I don't have much of a say here, but I can't just stand silent and let this go through without just asking you to reach into your heart and think about this. There's some good intent here, but how about the least of us economically impacted on this? What's going to happen to those folks? I think you and I know, and that troubles me. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman Willis. Councilman Willis's motion is to cease taking action on this pending ordinance, as I understand it, Councilman Willis. To table, I think, is the formal
Yes, sir.
motion. Am I correct in my understanding your motion, Councilman?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Councilman Willis makes motion to table. Is there a second to Councilman Willis's motion to table?
I'll second for discussion.
Councilman Brand motions a second to table, made by second Councilman Willis. Discussion.
Yes.
Councilman,
If we keep tabling, we're not even deferring, we're talking about tabling, our tenants will continue to live in squalor. The ones that are living in these houses that are inhabitable already, they will continue to live that way. We've been tabling this for some years already. I remember when it came up a long time ago, when Robinson and Williams was still on council. It was tabled then. And now we're trying to table again. What happens to those tenants who need our help? What happened to those tenants who can't speak up for themselves or don't know how to speak up for themselves? What happened to them? Landlords are already raising rents. They're not raising rents because of this ordinance. They're using this ordinance to an advantage to get more money. Greed is what's raising the rents. Not us. Greed is what's raising these rents. Because the ones that's raised rents already, we haven't even passed an ordinance. So how can you justify that?
Mr. Mayor, may I amend it to defer this? I certainly am not asking anybody that I serve with on this council to ignore this issue. I'm just asking you, let's take the time and see how we least impact what we're doing, least impact those at the bottom of this end of process. And the questions were asked today, what's going to happen to them? They've signed a lease, they've paid a U-Haul, or they've hauled their stuff in or their belongings into a house, and now they're being moved out. Is this what we're wanting to see? I don't think so. And I just amend my motion to defer. So if not this council, the next council can take this up and discuss it to the point that people are comfortable on this council or the future council with us not being there. I realize I won't be there, but to have reasonable conversations to try to come to a solution that is best interest of all. Thank you.
Well, recast his motion as a motion to defer. I'm sure Councilman Brand seconds the motion to defer. Councilwoman, I think Councilwoman Williams-Blake and Councilman Brand have both asked to be recognized. Councilman Brand defers to Councilwoman Williams-Blake.
I just want to, I heard what Councilman Willis said, and I remember many months ago, many times we discussed rentals. You and I live in the same neighborhood. You gave a passionate speech about short-term rentals and how we were going to hold people accountable and multiple cars parking in yards. When did your opinion change on all of that?
Well, my opinion hadn't changed. I'm glad you asked me that. I think when I look at what we're doing here, for some reason, some on this council want to push this through before the council body changes. And I certainly would like to see legislation move forward, but I've been on this council 8 years and I've never, ever seen legislation pushed forward this fast. And this is a critical move for our city as it relates to rental housing. I'm not totally opposed to it. I'm just opposed to the way we as a council are doing business right now. Matter of fact, I'm ashamed of what I'm hearing in here, because I don't think we as a council are considering all the aspects of what our decisions are going to be. And to answer the question, no, I haven't changed my opinion about about short-term rentals, how it impacts the neighborhoods. But I am concerned about the constituents I represent and all the constituents I represent. And it's certainly not trying to protect landlords. I think we can do both. I think there's a way, if we stop this shortcut approach to a very important ordinance, this council or the future council can come up with some solutions of mediation that will not impact those that we're trying to protect. So I agree with you. I haven't changed my position. Our residential areas are our most important part of what we do as a council in protecting. But we also need to protect our citizens too that don't have a choice sometimes. And quite honestly, I don't think we've got to that yet. But thank you for asking me, and I appreciate the opportunity to respond.
Mr. President.
Mr. Mayor, first I want to thank Jim and what he's done with this ordinance. A lot of time has gone into there. And Clint, thank you also from the staff and planning side. Certainly appreciate that. I've heard this, Pat, like you had when Billy D and Ned were in there 15 years ago. We've never come to resolution on this thing. I will say that this is as close to having a final document as I've ever seen. I feel like it's an outstanding work in progress. I would just like to see a little bit more community involvement on a one-on-one basis, only because I'm not a fan of Zoom at all. And I feel like a face-to-face issue is a lot better. And for that reason, a lot of the comments that all of y'all have made, I certainly agree with. I just feel like it's a great work in progress and we need to give a little more time. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Pro Tem. Members, I'll tell you, this is the end of my 12 years on council. And I do want to take a second in the middle of this discussion, which is a very important discussion, to acknowledge my friends and colleagues on council. Buddy and I commented at the last meeting that we couldn't remember the last time we voted on the opposite side of an issue. And I think that's a testament to the collegiate nature of this group, the friendships and the trust that exist and the relationships. And I think that is, frankly, that's more important than anything we'll do today or anything we'll do tomorrow, or anything we did last week or last month or last year. And that's really, I think, hopefully, I believe that will be the legacy of this council going forward, that we've dealt with difficult issues. We haven't shied away from dealing with hard issues. We haven't shied away from situations where we disagreed with one another. And yet we heard each other out, and sometimes we agreed and sometimes we didn't. And we together did what we thought was the best thing for this city. And I think together we've improved this city. I will tell you that, as Buddy acknowledges, this has been something I remember my first year as mayor. A young lady came up in front of us to talk about the problems of landlords and slumlords in Northwest Florence. And Teresa now has been on council with us for, I don't know, over 10 years now, Councilwoman Irvin, and is poised to finally take a substantial step in addressing this issue. This is an issue that's plagued this community for a long, long time. And I agree with Buddy. Boy, I tell you, this Zoom is not an enjoyable way to conduct business and to talk with one another. But I also I am persuaded by what Pat says, which is when you're living in that house that doesn't have a floor that functions and doesn't have a ceiling that functions, and you're heating with the oven, and you know that it's a violation of the ordinance, and city staff has told you it's a violation of the ordinance, but you've all been told by city staff that there ain't nothing that we can do because the owner lives outside of town and we don't have any way to serve them. That's just not good enough. And I believe that we have to take action. So I would respectfully oppose my friend Glenn's motion to defer with friendship and respect. Very well. There is pending before us a motion to defer that's been seconded by Councilman Brand. All in favor of the motion to defer, please indicate by saying aye.
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 And opposed, like sign. Nay.
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 Very well.
Nay.
The motion fails, but I know with friendship and respect. Okay. Very well. What remains then is the motion to amend this October 5th version that's my motion to amend, which would amend the ordinance that was passed for first reading in September. All in favor of that motion to amend, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
And opposed, like sign. Very well, the motion to amend passes. That leaves, I think if my Robert's rules are correct, that we still have to take action on the principal ordinance now having been amended. Am I right? Yes. Buddy got nervous. We're talking about Robert's rules again. But, all right, so then I suppose the vote will be the same, but all in favor of the now amended version of the rental registry ordinance, please indicate by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Very well, and opposed, like sign.
Nay.
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 Very well. Let the record reflect that the ordinance passes. And again, let me say to my colleagues, thank you for your hard work and for the efforts that everyone has put that have all been well-intentioned and vigorous. Very well. Now, the next matter for our consideration, if you can believe it. I'm sorry.
I'm not, we might want to do a show of hands on that last vote.
Okay.
I heard a nay come in at the end, but
Yeah,
I wasn't sure.
All right, very well.
Where it came from or what the count.
Let us poll the council just so everybody's clear. This Zoom business creates some uncertainties. Let's review the bidding. What occurred is that the ordinance that passed first reading in September was amended by the motion to amend, and the amendment was the October 5th version. Okay. The question in front of this council is the passage of the ordinance as drafted in the October 5th version. Mr. Peterson, have I stated that correctly? Okay. Very well. Would all the members who are in favor of the passage of that ordinance adopting the rental registry, please indicate by raising your hands. Very well. All right, so Jim, please keep your hands up so make sure we do. Let the record reflect the votes in favor of myself, Councilman Jabali, Councilman Williams-Blake, Councilwoman Urban, Councilwoman Moore. Very well. And opposed, please also raise your hands. Very well. Councilman Willison, Councilman Brand voted nay.
What?
I think that's great, and I think you're right. I think what we heard was delay from the process of the Zoom. So
that could be.
That's what I thought that the vote was, but thank you for clarifying, Mr. Peterson. Very well. Okay. Now, next matter for our consideration, in fact, is an introduction of an ordinance for first reading, if we can believe that. That is Bill 2020-36 for first reading, an ordinance to annex property owned by the Grove at Ebenezer LLC, located as an extension of Sunflower Bluff Drive and being a portion of tax map number 00075-01-221. Before us, we have Mr. Dudley to inform us on this. Y'all will remember some time back, Representative Lowe came to us with a master plan for the development of the Grove at Ebenezer. In that plan, which was hashed out at long length by staff and then approved by council, there were policies of annexation and the design standards and so forth and the development standards. As I understand it, this is incident to that. So that Mr. Dudley can explain and tell you how I'm wrong about what I just said, perhaps. Can we have a motion in a second?
So moved.
It's a motion by the pro tem. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Councilman Wills. Mr. Dudley.
Thank you very much. And I think you did a great presentation. This is incident to that. It did pass zoning for Planning Commission and City Council back in 2016. So the zoning of planned development was applied. This is an additional 17 acres planned for development within the Grove planned development. And they are required by the development agreement to annex prior to development. So this is exactly incident to that. Yes.
Very well. Thank you, Mr. Dudley. There's been a motion and a second. Any questions?
Just one question. Where in relationship, because I forgot to bring my pack, where is that where's that piece of property, please? As the Grove sits.
As the Grove sits and Grove Boulevard goes
Yes.
through the development, and there's a storm pond just behind the houses that are developed along Grove Boulevard in the single family section.
Is it
It's
next
just
to King's Academy?
It's actually back interior to the property,
Okay.
back behind the storm pond. Yes. I can't share my screen at the moment. It wasn't
I
letting
was
me.
just trying to get it.
That's okay.
Clubhouse is?
Yes.
It's
behind
on
the
the
club.
other side.
Okay.
Of the clubhouse.
Thank you.
There you
Oh, yeah, I got you.
go. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dillon. Thank you, Mr. President. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor, please indicate by saying aye.
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 Opposed, like sign. All right, very well. That measure passed unanimously. The next matter for our consideration are appointments to boards and commissions, and this shouldn't be too terribly complicated. There's an appointment to the Civic Center Commission that falls to Councilman Brand. Mr. Pro Tem, what say you?
Yes, Mr. Mayor and council members, I would like to appoint not only a good banker, but a friend of mine, Alan Griffin. He's with First Citizens Bank. He's a commercial loan officer. He's a long-term Florence resident. He was also down in Myrtle Beach with a banker down there. He's got over 30 years of banking experience and a graduate of Davidson College.
Very well. Appointment, there's second by Councilman Willis. Discussion. Hearing none, all in favor, please indicate by saying aye.
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 Opposed, like sign. Very well. It falls to me an appointment to the Design Review Board. And I believe my appointment is Mr. Mike Pageant, whose information should be in your packet from Mr. Pageant's Engineering and Construction Company. I'm correct about this, aren't I, Mr. Davis? That's my appointment. Is there a second?
Second.
There's a second. And Councilman Brand and Councilwoman Irvin second the motion to add Mr. Pageant to the Design Review Board. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Opposed, like sign. Very well. Mr. Pageant's added to the Design Review Board. There are two other appointments that remain for which we do not have applicants. Both Councilwoman Irvin and myself have these appointments. One is to the Design Review Board, which requires a landscape architect. And then the other is the Construction Maintenance Board of Adjustments and Appeals, or is that terminology? And are there any particular requirements for that, Ms. Davis?
I think that one is at large.
That one is at large. So we would encourage those folks at home, please apply. We do need qualified applicants to add to these boards. As we stand right now, Councilman Irvin and I don't have folks to appoint. Very well, unless Councilman Irvin, unless I've spoken out of order. Am I correct in that?
You're correct.
Very well, thank you, ma'am. Then the remainder of the agenda is just the accommodation tax funds appropriation, which we already took care of earlier in the ordinance. Ms. Oliver, anything that remains?
Mr. Mayor.
Is there a motion we adjourn?
So moved.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, you have a hand up.
Yep, I'm sorry, Councilman Girelli.
Yeah, just one final thing. I'm very pleased that we have this rental registry that is passed and that is in place. I think it's very important that we've done it. I do feel like there are clarifications that should have been made and would be better, but those are relatively minor clarifications. The substance, the importance of addressing these critical needs in our community has been a long time coming. And I think we've seen from something council today, something that we can all be proud of and will help move our community forward. And I'm very, very pleased with the substantive actions taken, even though I feel like some of the clarifications would have made the document and the ordinance cleaner and more efficient. Thank you.
Very well. If there's no objection, we stand adjourned.
Have a good day.
You too.